Horizon Forbidden West is a disappointing sequel to my 2017 Game of the Year. It offers more video game than Horizon Zero Dawn, but isn't necessarily a better one for it. As much as I enjoyed Zero Dawn, more of the same is not enough when there's a 5-year gap between releases. Iterative sequels are acceptable for annual games, but for major releases like this one, I expect the developers to respond to legitimate criticisms of the previous game, and ideally adopt improvements evident elsewhere in the genre. Instead, Guerrilla Games simply added features and content to what was already there and made little effort to rectify any of the problems. The only lesson it took from the critical and commercial success of Breath of the Wild was that hang gliders are cool. It noticed that many games have grapple hooks now, but ignored why they are fun to use, limiting them to boring contextual button prompts that sap momentum from the action instead of adding to it. It saw free climbing in the Assassin's Creed games, but instead of making everything climbable, it let you climb more things, but only where you're expressly allowed to do so. And that's just Guerrilla not keeping up with the competition. It certainly hasn't pushed the genre forward. Mission design is still frustratingly linear and overly reliant on spamming the equivalent of detective vision. Puzzles are dire, managing to somehow be straightforward and obtuse at the same time, and they only work as puzzles by taking away Aloy's ability to climb the most basic of hurdles. Combat is pretty much the same with more options piled on top. Unfortunately, more options don't necessarily change how you play the game, or make it more interesting, and that's definitely the case here. There's a huge focus on crafting, which is tedious and unnecessary as crafting tends to be. The story isn't as compelling as the first game, although I'll let Guerrilla off for that one. It was always going to be nigh on impossible to improve on the first story, which was all about uncovering the mystery of the past alongside fixing the present. The sequel can only offer the present. To top it all off, Forbidden West is surprisingly buggy for a marquee Sony release. I don't mean Bethesda buggy, just more buggy than I'm entirely comfortable with. Completely playable, but annoying. It needed another 3 to 6 months of work. The frustrating thing is that Guerrilla Games clearly knows about these problems. There are options in the menus, with more being added in patches, that attempt to mitigate some of the more annoying aspects of the game. You can opt to permanently turn on lines to show what you can climb, and you can now remove pickup animations entirely. However, you wouldn't need lines at all if you could climb everything in the first place, and the pickup animations are annoying because there's so much to pick up due to the focus on crafting. Instead of reworking the game to remove the problems, Guerrilla Games opted to stick band-aids on them, if you'll excuse the American vernacular. Unfortunately, band-aids don't fix broken bones. Guerrilla Games spent an inordinate amount of time making Forbidden West to look insanely pretty in 4K. It's an incredible looking game, and look, maybe it's my age, but I just don't care much about graphical fidelity. It's well below gameplay and story and things I look for, and I'd go for style over realism any day. As you can tell, this critique veers heavily negative because I'm incredibly disappointed in the game. However, I don't think it's a bad game. It's at least decent, maybe good. I'd probably give it a 7 out of 10. The thing is, nearly everything good about Forbidden West was also good in Zero Dawn, and I've already talked about that game at length. My Horizon Zero Dawn video was my very first video for this channel 5 years ago, which means this channel is 5 years old, I guess. Bloody hell. I will try to be positive where it's due, but I desperately want to put some constructive criticism out there because we're clearly going to get a third game, and I don't want to see the same problems repeated in 5 years' time. Forbidden West doesn't have one glaring problem that could be easily fixed. There's no one game Guerrilla Games could copy from to solve all its problems. No, not that one, or that one. But the answers are all out there, spread across multiple games. Guerrilla Games didn't need to break open new game design doors, it simply needed to walk through ones other game developers have already opened, or at least left a key under the mat. In rough order, Horizon Forbidden West's problems are quest design, exploration and environmental navigation, general open world nonsense, crafting, combat, story, and then performance. Many of these areas overlap. Quest design in Forbidden West is just tragic. I'm not sure if it's actually worse than that of similar games, or if it's just I'm getting so fed up with the formula that it feels worse. It doesn't matter, subjectivity and all that. Most missions follow a familiar pattern. Go to place, look around with focus, follow path with focus, maybe climb a bit, fight monster, find injured or dead person. Not always in that order, but that's the gist of it. I remember when The Witcher 3 came out in 2015 and people fairly complained about how the quests were overly reliant on using Witcher vision to follow paths instead of letting the player do the work. The whole spam a special vision mode thing was becoming a bit overplayed. As someone who loves The Witcher 3 overall, this didn't ruin the game for me, but it was clearly something future games should look to improve upon, and it probably needed phasing out. Cut to 7 years later, where we are still doing the same damn thing. This is not just a Forbidden West problem, and I don't expect Guerrilla Games to necessarily break new ground, although it would be nice. Maybe that means this criticism isn't quote unquote fair, but it's a problem regardless. The crazy part is that in some follow the trail missions, you can actually see the footsteps you're following without focus. You don't need to use it. But if you don't, Aloy keeps telling you to, and the game doesn't know how to react, particularly when companions are following you. Forbidden West offers a choice of Explorer or Guided mode, with Explorer supposedly putting limited information on your HUD and Guided a lot more. When combined with a dynamic HUD option, the screen is fairly minimal, although you are still guided directly to the exact spot you need to be. I also turned off the tooltips, but they kept appearing anyway. Whatever mode you pick, you're told where to go at all times, and Gaia help you if you veer off that path. The best example of the quest design's utter inflexibility was a mission to break into a rebel camp. The game wants you to approach from a certain direction to force you to fight a small group outside first before moving into the camp for the main event. What no one at Guerrilla seems to have realised is that this is an open world game and there's nothing to stop you heading slightly off the path to make it directly to the camp instead of walking the long way around. I walked behind the small group undetected and to the front door of the camp. I'd avoided the fight entirely and could now progress into the camp. Except, of course, I couldn't. The game wouldn't let me. There's a ladder here that you need someone to knock down for you, but they just sit there silently until you defeat the other enemies. You can't shout to them or ask them to knock it down. You might be wondering why you even need a ladder here. That scaffolding looks perfectly climbable for someone with Aloy's ability, right? Well, no. Guerrilla Games turned the climbing points off here to stop you doing that, even though quite honestly I could climb this, and I'm 38 years old with tendinitis in my shoulders. Once you defeat the nearby enemies, this person perks up and knocks down the ladder. As you'll see shortly, the quest design problems are closely linked to the exploration issues. There's a quest where you crash land after a hot air balloon ride. You need to push forward but are faced with an insurmountable wall. And by insurmountable, I mean very much surmountable. But Guerrilla turned the climbing markers off, something it does quite a lot, as we'll see. You can just about get up here anyway if you're persistent, but it won't help you much because the NPC can't climb. So what's the point of this bit? Why has Aloy's ability to climb been taken away? Is it to engage in a cool puzzle? Do you have to work together with the guy to find an inventive solution? Maybe just give him a boost up? Nope, you need to knock down this tree. Think about this for a second. The quest designers went to the effort of removing Aloy's ability to climb something the player intrinsically expects her to climb because they wanted the player to instead kick down a tree. Why? What's the point? How is this interesting in any way? What's even more annoying is that they didn't need to stop Aloy climbing the wall. The quest could just ask you to help get the NPC across. I mean, that would make more sense. It's almost comical how contrived some quests are. For example, Aloy needs to get to the other side of these rocks. She can collapse rocks like this, however it won't work from this side. So you go around the corner and break down an identical looking set of rocks, then move through and break the other rocks from the correct side. For context, you can break these rocks underwater, so the idea that maybe you don't have enough room to do it here is ridiculous. I'm not sure why they didn't change it so that the exit was a solid wall with red explosive stuff or a grapple point on the inside. That would at least make sense within the scope of the game's own rules. There are a few examples of silliness with this quest in the swamp. First of all, I should be able to reach this ledge with the glider, but Aloy refused to grab hold at the end because that would skip the planned puzzle. God forbid you actually think for yourself. I'm also convinced that the glider movement is artificially restricted and that I should have been able to land on the ledge easily, but I can't prove that. Then there's this main puzzle with the crane. This is a great example of how you should absolutely not try to engage your brain whatsoever. Logic means nothing. You will be penalised for thinking. There's a highlighted piece of wood blocking some ropes that you can shoot to break a connection. Except shooting it does nothing. That's because you're not supposed to do it yet. There's a grapple point for you to pull at, but it's behind solid cement, so how do you reach it? Well, obviously, the perfectly logical solution is to dive underwater and blow up rocks, because the red explosive stuff works underwater apparently. It would have made more sense to use collapsing rocks here and not the red stuff, but whatever. This then makes the entire crane structure move, which breaks the concrete so that you can pull out some planks, which means a bunch more concrete falls out and tips the crane. Shooting the block over the ropes now works for some reason. Like, this isn't engaging quest design, this is simply interacting with the things that are marked up until you happen to do them in the right order and a thing happens. None of this occurred to me naturally. I certainly didn't say to myself, I know, I'll go underwater, create an explosion which will move the structure down the tracks instead of collapsing it into the water, and that will then make the concrete break, allowing me to pull out some wood which will collapse a bunch of concrete to tip the crane. Instead I just interacted with the only things I could interact with. Like, this area just made me mad. Moving on, I can't open this gate because there are still enemies alive in the area, but they're way back in another room and aren't coming after me. Like, why have the restriction? Just have it so that enemies attack you during the animation if you try to open it while they are still nearby. I'll give some credit where it's due. The quests do generally cater for situations where players have already done some of the work, like when I'd previously cleared out the rebel camp here. Although it does mean this person stayed hidden in the ground for about a week, waiting for us to show up. Forbidden West's equivalent of Zelda dungeons is the cauldrons. Now, as regular viewers will know, I'm not exactly a big Zelda fan. However, while in these cauldrons, I was often so bored that I would have voluntarily played not just Breath of the Wild, but probably even Zelda 2. Not only are cauldron puzzles restrictive beyond all belief, they are criminally dull in the process. This is especially egregious because cauldrons are these weird high-tech places underground that don't need to be limited by any standard environmental design. They could be anything really, the possibilities are endless. So what do we get? A bunch of visually messy rooms where the only challenge is identifying the bit of the environment the game wants you to interact with and then doing so in such a restrictive and limited way that it's almost impossible to fail. The only time I got remotely stuck in these areas was the first time I was dealing with a new thing, like the blue discs. I didn't know my grapple hook would latch onto these to pull the crane thing around because previously the grapple had only been capable of pulling down walls with a specific blue attachment. When you know how to interact with things, the puzzles become routine. Remember, these areas are completely optional. The devs could do loads of wacky stuff here. They could even implement jumping challenges that require you to actually time your own jumps, like the original Tomb Raider games, instead of just relying on canned animations. Okay, maybe not too much like the old Tomb Raider games, you had to be precise to the point of absurdity in some of those, but still, they could do something fun. Use the grapple hook to swing across chasms or something. Instead, the idea of a challenge is rotating vents. You have to climb quickly or they might turn around again and you'll fall off. Exciting, right? All this means is you end up waiting around for them to spin before climbing. Or what about pulling very obviously marked up climbing points out with your grapple before doing some risk-free, challenge-free climbing? It's so tedious. There's nothing interesting here. And then we have the ruins. Oh god, the ruins. I truly lack the skill to adequately describe how pathetic these are. Ruins are, as you might expect, the remains of old buildings from 1,000 years ago which, for reasons that are never explained, have mysterious orbs tucked away in them. My main issue with the ruins is that they rely on making Aloy useless to create a puzzle. If Aloy had even half of her normal climbing ability, she could skip right to the end of every puzzle, so that ability has to be taken away. And it's borderline comically bad that Aloy can't go through gaps that are very obviously big enough to crawl or reach through because that's not part of the design. Okay, I feel like this criticism is harsh and might get some pushback. We just have to accept limitations like this, right? It's a video game. We play by the rules, we can clearly tell Aloy isn't meant to go through that gap, and there's obviously another solution. However, the puzzle design is plagued by this problem and it becomes hard to ignore. What's the point in going to all this effort to create an incredibly realistic looking world, presumably to immerse the player, and then snapping them out of the world every few minutes with painfully restrictive rules? For example, this path looks as real as all the other paths. Why can't I go down here? This problem is of Guerrilla's own making. They didn't need to show the orb out in the open like this. You can find them through the focus, so just put up solid walls around the damn thing. All the ruin puzzles are much the same and usually consist of pulling a box around to reach an area that you should already be able to reach. For example, you need a box in the elevator here to jump up through the gap, except Aloy can jump up through these gaps and does so in other locations. Guerrilla just turned off the climbing ability on this one ledge. I think Guerrilla also deactivated Aloy's ability to fling herself into the air from this grapple point, because otherwise she'd be able to float to the box over here. Or maybe it's just a bug. You usually then have to blow open a hole in the wall with the red explosive stuff, or perhaps pull down a wall, which you can only do from one side, and then drag the box through the gap to access another previously unreachable, but really perfectly reachable location. In some puzzles you need to power up a lift or get a battery across water, or in one case get a battery to a lift before the battery weirdly loses power. This just requires you to go around the corner and blow open a wall to create a shortcut. The hardest climbing gets is needing to pull ledges down with the grapple to create a path. Again, there's no thought involved here. You don't have to position them yourself or think about which ones to use, just look for the blue markers and use the grapple on them. There are often multiple ledges lined up together, so you have to stand there and slowly pull the ledges down, one after the other. Let's look at some examples of how restrictive this all is. One time you have to put one box on top of another to get enough height, even though Aloy could so obviously climb this fence. I guess the metal has rusted and she's not up on her tetanus shots. In another ruin you have to pull a train over to a specific point to grab a yellow ledge, even though there's a perfectly reachable ledge just below, and this entire area is so easily climbable. In this area you need to pull a box towards you, but the railing makes the grapple not work because I think the game actually wants you to drain the water first. I managed to cheese this by perching myself just the other side of the railing and doing it from there. Even though these puzzles are designed so that there's only one solution, I did take some pleasure from breaking them. If you're feeling generous, you could say the game's mechanics are providing options, but it's clearly not intended to be played like this, and the game goes out of its way to stop you being creative, so I'm not inclined to cut it any slack. For example, one of the tougher ruins goes all out with the challenge because you have to move a box in an elevator twice. Both times you shouldn't really need a box. You need to shoot down a ladder, but the environment is carefully crafted to make it so you can't shoot it without the box, although I did manage to do an awkward side jump and shoot it mid-air. The other time was to reach this ledge after a lower ledge point fell away. The game does that a lot actually. I guess the devs were paranoid you wouldn't know where to go, so they gave you an obvious climbing point and make you break it to find another way up. The devs were terrified players might get stuck, so wanted to make it as obvious as possible where to go. Another example of sticking a band-aid on a bigger problem. Even though puzzles are simple, they aren't always easy. The solutions are straightforward, but you have to think in a very limited or specific way to solve them. It can take a moment to figure out what the game expects of you. Better be quick though, because Aloy won't hesitate to spoil the solution for you quicker than those scummy YouTubers who spoil the ending of games and movies in thumbnails. She talks a lot, like all the time. Whether it's about the environment or where to head to next or what missions can be done in the area, I'm not sure why Guerrilla felt the need to add this. The map is so detailed that players are never going to get lost. I wonder whether the Explorer mode was initially less handholdy with fewer icons, making Aloy's comments more useful, but then it was focus tested out. Anyway, Aloy's constant commentary is a touch annoying in the open world, but ignorable. Where it becomes a problem is during puzzles, because Aloy tells you the answer way too quickly. She gets to the point quicker than most guide writers actually. I don't take issue with hints being provided to players or giving the option to basically skip puzzles. Thing is, I don't think these puzzles are supposed to be challenging. They aren't Bubba Is You style mind twisters. They're supposed to be relatively easy and chill, but players can get stuck because they aren't well designed. So Guerrilla added in hints to guide players as a band-aid on the problem of bad puzzle design. I'm convinced that focus testing showed people getting stuck on these puzzles too often, so Ashley Birch was dragged back into the voice booth to record a bunch of hints. If it's not obvious that you need to grapple onto a particular item or shoot something in a particular position or reflood a room, then perhaps the problem is the presentation and how the mechanics have been introduced. And if you're going to include a hint system, why not have it be under the player's control? Sometimes Aloy tells you what to do while you're doing it, like this instance where I'm dragging the boxes into position because I know what to do, but Aloy insists on telling me anyway. Or when I needed to enter a code and the game wouldn't trust me to figure out that the month of October might be represented by the number 10.
So the company was founded in October,
which is the 10th month of the year.
The only time Aloy's noise is useful is when she tells you to leave an area and come back later because you don't have the necessary ability. Although it is annoying that you have to leave areas and come back later. I wouldn't mind if the new abilities were good, but you don't even get abilities, not really. You get what are essentially keys. This is another pet peeve of mine. Lots of games want to do that thing where they make you revisit earlier locations with a new ability to access something previously unreachable. It makes players feel accomplished and that they've learned something new. Just like every game wants to be an RPG and a looter and a survival game, every game wants to be a Metroidvania. Except in games like Metroid, the new abilities change the way you play the entire game. They don't just unlock doors. Dropping bombs isn't useful because it blows open blockages. It's used in combat too. A double jump gives you increased mobility generally, not just to reach higher ledges to progress. Forbidden West doesn't have abilities, it has keys. The explosive stuff might as well be a red key that opens red doors. The grapple is a blue key to open the blue door. The ability to override metal flowers is a green key. I know the grapple does technically do other stuff, but as we'll see, it's not fun. Late in the story you can fly around on a sunwing. This is genuinely great because it lets you skip tedious navigation. However, outside of specific quests designed around flight, I could only find one location where you seemingly need to fly to access it, and that's this terrible fenced area, which Aloy should blatantly be able to climb. I don't find this key system at all interesting. Every time you see a blue grapple point on a wall, or the red explosive stuff, or vines near a metal flower, it might as well be a door with a key card as far as I'm concerned. And once you have all the key cards, it doesn't matter which one you need to use. It's repetition disguised as variety. Exploration and environmental navigation is the one feature I can't believe isn't better. I'm genuinely shocked that more improvements weren't made. As you may remember, climbing in Horizon Zero Dawn was very restrictive. If you wanted to climb a mountain, you had to look for the rocks with specific white markings. Aloy could sometimes climb up cliffs without those markers by sort of Skyrim hopping her way up, but that clearly wasn't intended and was often more hassle than it was worth. In 2017 that was a common approach in open world games, especially with mountainous terrain, so I could live with it. I didn't know any better. However, a lot has changed in the last 5 years. In fact, a lot changed about a week after the release of Zero Dawn when Breath of the Wild came out and let you climb wherever you wanted with just a stamina limitation. Thing is, while Breath of the Wild got all the credit for giving the player flexibility with climbing, Assassin's Creed Origins did a similar thing about 6 months later, and is a more appropriate comparison for a game like this. Origins and subsequent Assassin's Creed games let you climb pretty much whatever you want without limitation. That started in 2017. So when developing Forbidden West, Guerrilla Games had 3 main options for climbing. It could stick to its guns and say that Aloy can only climb where there is appropriate assistance because she's not a capable free climber. It could let her climb anything but with a limitation such as stamina to add a challenge, or it could let her climb everything with no limitation. Guerrilla Games opted for a weird combination of option A and option C. In terms of the character's climbing ability, Aloy can climb basically anything. She certainly doesn't need carefully crafted handholds and will clamber up sheer rock face. But she's not allowed to climb anything. She can only grab edges that have been specifically programmed into the game as climbable. That means you might approach a cliff that looks like lots of other cliffs you've climbed, only to find out it's not climbable because computer says no. The problem is, Aloy can climb so much of the environment that the times she can't feel heavily contrived. It's like the starting point was to have everything be climbable, and then the devs opted to take away climbable sections to block progress or make puzzles harder. There's no rationale for what you can and can't climb. Why can I climb up one part of this structure and not the other? It's absolutely nonsensical. Take this mountain. I was able to climb up here on the way to a rebel camp, but then the handholds just end and I can't go any further for some reason. What's the point in letting me climb all this way and then stopping me in my tracks? Tell me what this adds to the game. The only way to know for sure what you can climb is to, well, throw Aloy at it or press focus to make the yellow lines appear. Guerrilla knew the guessing game about what is and isn't climbable was annoying, so it gives you the option to display all the edges. Of course, this looks terrible and doesn't solve the underlying problem. It's another band-aid. On top of this, the climbing doesn't feel good at all. There's way too much reliance on canned animations and scripting. A jump might look too far, but if Aloy is supposed to make the jump, she'll pull off a ridiculous leap that would have the long jump champion in the Kangaroo Olympics looking on in envy. Other times, jumps that look easy will see Aloy do a weird little hop and only just grab hold of the edge to make it look tense and exciting, something that got old with the third Uncharted game. The animations are often odd. Aloy jumps onto small boxes with this weird grab that makes it look like she's clinging onto the edge of a cliff instead of properly climbing onto the box. And sometimes she misses grabs like this one on the drone or this one on the tool neck. I think the tool neck one misses because the game actually wants you to jump onto a higher part of the tool neck. I thought that would be unreachable, so I aimed at a lower section. Turns out you can reach the higher one. Climbing isn't smooth either. When Aloy leaps from one ledge to another or reaches the top of a climb, there's this weird pause where Aloy stops and you can't move her forward. It's only for half a second, but it ruins the flow and means the player is not in control. I guess the game isn't sure if you really want to move off the ledge and is looking for something else to jump to. Sometimes you have to press a button to climb to the next ledge, but not always, so you end up hammering buttons a lot anyway. In Origins, you just push forward. Objects like these train carriages are weirdly finicky. You can hang on the back, but you can't climb up onto the train from here. I thought that meant you couldn't climb on it at all, but for some reason you can from the side. And sometimes these annoying canned animations don't work properly, which leads to this. I thought perhaps I was being unfair and misremembering how Assassin's Creed Origins felt, so I went back to play it, and it really is so much smoother. There are no awkward pauses between objects, you just push forward without interruption. Again, this was 2017. I'm not even a big fan of the Assassin's Creed games, by the way. Like, Origins was good, but the subsequent two, not so much. But credit where it's due, though. I'm not sure how to describe this next part, even remotely, technically, but Aloy doesn't feel properly attached to the world. She just sort of floats across it. She gets stuck on things she should ignore, like a stick on the ground, but will leap on top of desks or shelves with the slightest push in that direction. Like, why is this automatically clambered over while this stops her in her tracks? I can't trust the environment. When sneaking up on this enemy, I can't do a stealth kill because we're at slightly different elevations, and yet at other times, when scripted, Aloy interacts with her environment during kill animations. It's impressive, just inconsistent. Sometimes Aloy won't climb through vents she should clearly be able to move through, or doesn't climb basic terrain properly. She'll also land on parts of the scenery that she isn't meant to. Now, this can be helpful, but it looks terrible. It's weird because the natural world design actually supports Aloy more than the game is prepared to accept because of its rules. I played Ghost of Tsushima last year and Jin absolutely felt grounded to the world. There's a weight to him. It's not necessarily slow or clunky. I'm not asking for Horizon to play like Red Dead Redemption 2, I just need Aloy to feel like she's in the world and not an object sliding across it. Movement is part of why I didn't enjoy exploring the world in Forbidden West. I resorted to fast travel constantly. Aloy has a mount she can ride, it just sucks. Its speed is either too fast or too slow, and the world isn't designed with mounted navigation in mind. It's too much of a pain to use the paths and avoid the machines. I loved riding around in Ghost of Tsushima and even in The Witcher 3. I think that reference might be controversial because Witcher 3, particularly Roach, had a few movement issues of its own. However, I played that game for over 100 hours without using fast travel. I enjoyed riding Roach around and exploring the world. I enjoyed taking my time. I can't say that about Forbidden West. The environment sometimes hides invisible walls that stop exploration being rewarding if you dare leave the beaten path. These look like normal bushes, but you can't get through them because the game wants you to take another route. Weirdly, there are also invisible walls in places where they absolutely aren't required, like why is there one here when the path ahead is blocked anyway? I have some sympathy with Guerrilla Games here. For story reasons, the world of Forbidden West has to be a cluttered mess to a certain extent. It's a young society building on the ruins of the old one. It's not supposed to look neat and tidy. There aren't going to be cities like Novigrad in the Forbidden West. That can't be helped, but I also can't help the fact that I don't enjoy navigating this world. There are some positives. The glider is a good addition mainly because it lets you skip navigating large tracts of land that would otherwise be tedious to run through. You get some nice views while gliding too. It rarely needs to be used though. There are a few jumps within cauldrons that you have to glide across, but it doesn't change the game and certainly isn't integral to exploration. Then there's the grapple. This is such a waste. Grapples are objectively fun and should be in every video game. They aid exploration and make movement more enjoyable. You can use them to fling yourself forward to get around faster or to reach previously inaccessible areas. In combat they can pull you closer to an enemy or pull the enemy closer to you. Or maybe remove pieces of armour. Grapples should be game changing. This one in Forbidden West is not. Aloy can only grapple onto specific grapple points, which more often than not are spots you'd easily be able to get to while climbing anyway. The grapple just makes it a bit quicker. I say a bit because these grapple points kill all momentum. Regardless of how fast Aloy is moving or the angle she is standing in relation to the grapple point when she uses it, the best she can do is fling herself straight up in the air a little bit. She never carries any forward momentum. Sometimes the grapple gets you to places you wouldn't be otherwise able to reach, but only because it's scripted that way. You can't be at all creative to sequence break anything. Grapple points are complete momentum killers. Occasionally you can chain grapple points together to skip sections that would otherwise be quite slow, but the camera often worked against me as if the game didn't want me doing that. In combat you can get extra height and do aerial attacks on enemies, which is fun, although you can achieve a similar result just by jumping off a slightly raised platform. Bizarrely, in a game where ripping off enemy armour is one of, if not the biggest part of combat, you cannot use the grapple hook to attach to enemy armour. Imagine hooking it to a machine and flying in to mount it mid-fight, or just having it zip you from one end of a battlefield to the other. One cool feature of the grapple is using it to swing back up to your sunwing. This looks fantastic. It's still very animation heavy, so it's not exactly scintillating gameplay wise, but that's fine. I was pleasantly surprised this was even an option, which says something for how limited the grapple is elsewhere. My overwhelming feeling while playing Forbidden West was that Guerrilla Games only gave Aloy more movement options because it felt it had to, not because it wanted to, and as such it didn't properly incorporate them into the world. The changes were all made grudgingly. Okay, fine, you want Aloy to climb everything, she can climb everything now. You have complete freedom, but only when we say so. Here's your damn glider, jump from ledge to ledge a few times and be grateful we let you use it at all. You think grapple hooks are fun? Lol, wait till you see this one. Have fun saving maybe a second of time getting to places you could already reach. It's a shame navigation is so tedious because Forbidden West is an open world game with all the connotations that come with that these days. Both Horizon Zero Dawn and Forbidden West had the misfortune of releasing just before games that made genuine and much needed efforts to push the open world genre forward, which in turn made the Horizon games look dated by comparison. When people criticise either game, they often do so in the context of Breath of the Wild or Elden Ring. You've probably seen Zero Dawn criticism that resembles the following. Horizon Zero Dawn is good, but it's just another cookie-cutter open world game, whereas Breath of the Wild is revolutionary. It's impossible to go back to games like Zero Dawn after playing the masterpiece that is Breath of the Wild. The sense of exploration and player freedom is unrivaled. There's no hand-holding. The game trusts the player's intelligence. You can kill the final boss right from the start, etc, etc. I always found this a touch unfair. First of all, Zero Dawn did make minor improvements to the genre, such as classifying less important quests as errands to make it clear they were optional, having fewer tower equivalents and having them be puzzles and events that you actually want to do, plus just less clutter and actually having a good story, something that is shockingly rare in open world games. Yes, it looked and felt a lot like other open world games, but it was one of the best, which of course is no mean feat in a packed crowd. Second, some of Breath of the Wild's good ideas only work because of its weaknesses in other areas. Sure, there's no map clutter and you can spot places to visit yourself, but that's because the world is so empty, and most places aren't that interesting. They often warp you to simple shrines. Enemy encounters are incredibly repetitive. You can kill the final boss early on because there is basically no story to speak of and no harm done if you skip it. The writing and characters are, well, let's just say they aren't to my tastes and leave it at that. The last thing I want is for all open world games to turn into Breath of the Wild. It's certainly not what I wanted for this sequel. They might technically be the same genre, but they are very different types of game. I want good stories, characters, combat and interesting worlds. But I also want game devs to borrow from Breath of the Wild where appropriate. Yes, it's probably the most overrated game ever made, but there are good ideas in there. For example, players seem to quite like exploring without being directed to every single point of interest. Take the hint and offer a sense of exploration that doesn't rely on automatically generated waypoint markers. Free climbing greatly adds to player freedom, so let players climb everywhere and design your puzzles around that. Guerrilla could even have experimented with the idea of letting the player tackle the final mission whenever they're ready. How about make the final boss easier if you collect all Gaia's subsystems or bring along more allies? I also like the idea of starting in the middle of the map and not simply moving from one side to the other, although that does go against the whole venturing west theme. Regardless, Guerrilla's failure to learn any lessons from Breath of the Wild is why I have no sympathy for Forbidden West seemingly getting the same kind of criticism through comparison to Elden Ring. Elden Ring is rightly getting praised for its approach to an open world, and the comparisons to Forbidden West are more justifiable. Frankly, Elden Ring looks a generation beyond Forbidden West. Guerrilla Games might have been surprised by Breath of the Wild and its innovations, however it can't be surprised that a game released 5 years later opted to build on what players liked about Breath of the Wild to make a compelling game. Elden Ring shouldn't be considered a surprise hit. The only surprise is that no other devs did it first, except I guess for that one attempt by Ubisoft. Gamers have been complaining about cookie-cutter open-world games for years, before Breath of the Wild even. From Software saw a trend and adapted. Guerrilla didn't. What's doubly annoying is that Guerrilla Games did take ideas and inspiration from other games, but only at a very shallow surface level. As with the glider, there are many features that have been added seemingly for the sake of it. Everyone loves crafting and hunting for animal skins, right? That was popular in 2012's Far Cry 3. Let's do more of that. Ignore how it's since been done to death and doesn't fit with a protagonist who has much more important stuff to do. Everyone loved that card game in Witcher 3, so Forbidden West needs a mini-game with spin-off and merchandise potential. Except this game isn't integrated into the world with new playing pieces available all over the place and NPCs constantly offering you a game. It's just another icon on the map. To be fair, it's not a bad game and effort was put into making it, just not into why or how it exists in the world. Someone at Guerrilla clearly likes Mass Effect 2 because Aloy now has a base of operations with a bunch of rooms that strangely open up one by one as you progress the story for no real reason. That cooking cat in Monster Hunter World was popular, so let's have a chef who prepares special meals just without the personality and with buffs that don't really help all that much or fit the enemies you fight. The kids sure do love cosmetics nowadays, so you can collect materials to change the colour of your gear and loot. Every game's a loot game now. And players shouldn't be allowed to finish games anymore because that's bad for some reason, so there's a bunch of side games and arenas and all the collectibles you could ever not want. My Horizon Forbidden West playthrough took 70 hours and it could have been a lot longer. This is easily a 100-hour game if you want to get everything. I didn't complete all the challenges or find every collectible or do every errand or have every conversation. Forbidden West might be double the size of Zero Dawn in terms of the amount of content. That's all games are now, right? Like, they're not art, they're just collections of content to be completed. There were many things I wanted from this sequel. Twice the amount of stuff to do was not one of them. Even things that were in the previous game have been made more laborious. Cauldrons are back and completing them lets you override other machine types, except in Forbidden West you also have to find a bunch of components for each machine before you can unlock the override. Why is overriding now harder to do? Not only has Aloy forgotten the skill, she's less efficient at relearning it. This game never misses the opportunity to send you scavenging for materials. Some of the content is okay, but generally the quality is spread too thin and the rewards are mediocre. There are 12 black boxes from crashed planes that offer machine parts and resources as rewards, plus an audio clip. There's usually a very light puzzle attached to these. The 8 ruins give you ornaments, which change the light display in Las Vegas. There are 6 signal lenses which give you a bit of loot and a pathetic 15 shards each. This amount was so low I don't know why they even bothered. There are 10 survey drones which do at least offer mini challenges for how to reach them. They change the background in Gaia's room in your base. War totems are for special face paints. There are 9 vista points which offer a glimpse into the past. These are still okay but were better suited to Zero Dawn, which was expressly about uncovering the past. Salvage contractors send you hunting for components and eventually you get a weapon out of it, although a few times the weapon was worse than one I already had of the same type. These quests are weird. Aloy always bangs on about how you must read the contract, but the contract rarely has anything interesting in it. At best it advises you to ride a mount to keep up with machines that run away from you, but that's it. Oh, and there are more rebel camps and outposts than I can be bothered to count. If you get the tags from the leaders you can exchange them for more resources. I still enjoy the tool necks and think they're a good way of uncovering the map icons while also requiring a bit of effort. There are some majestic shots to accompany them too this time. That said, it does feel like Guerrilla is running out of ideas for how to make jumping onto them an interesting puzzle. A couple like this one near the Ewok village involve a lot of waiting around for the tool neck to get in the right position before you can make the jump. You have to fly onto one of the tool necks, which means you can't do it until near the end of the story. The oddity here is that the tool neck in question is in an early part of the map, so by the time you unlock it, you will have been through this area a bunch already and uncovered everything. The hunting ground challenges return to teach you to use Aloy's full skill set, like aerial attacks and activating traps. The first few are okay, but many of them are miserable, especially on the hardest difficulty, for which they don't seem balanced at all. One of, if not the hardest thing I did in the entire game was a challenge to override a machine and use it to kill 2 other machines. The mounted combat isn't exactly thrilling, but it would be manageable if there weren't a huge tremor tusk nearby that nearly always spots you. If it does, it easily destroys the overridden machine and probably you along with it. You've got to hope you get the 2 kills quickly, which isn't necessarily easy when dealing with the clunky mounted combat. And if you mess up any trial, you have to trudge back to the starting point to reset, and the machines keep attacking you while you do so. You can try resetting from the nearest save, but this sometimes boots you back to another campfire. That might be a bug though. The hunting grounds give you a new currency that you can trade in for rewards elsewhere, because Forbidden West never outright gives you anything useful. It's always a thing to trade in for another thing somewhere else. This is arguably good because you can choose what you get, but there's a lack of satisfaction from completing tough challenges when the reward is just a few more medals that contribute to eventually getting a new weapon. Why not let me choose a weapon as a reward for mastering all the challenges in each location? At the very least, you should be able to trade in the medals at the hunting grounds. Instead, you have to go elsewhere, which detaches the event from the reward. In melee pits, you challenge increasingly difficult fighters and practice melee combos. I was pleasantly surprised at the breadth of options for melee attack strings. In addition to mixing up light and heavy attacks, you can do different combos by adding pauses between attacks or holding down buttons. Aloy's spear can be charged up to deal resonator damage to armour parts, which can then be blasted off with an arrow. Add in leap over attacks and the like, and you have the potential for some impressive highlight reels. Thing is, the combat still doesn't have much depth because none of this cool stuff is required or even encouraged. I didn't do the melee pits until after beating the games, for reasons I'll get to, but I never had a problem in melee combat. There's a forced melee fight right near the end of the game which you can win by just spamming the light attack button even on the hardest difficulty. The melee combos are skill unlocks, so the game can't assume you'll have them and therefore never requires them. The melee pits force you to use particular combos, but the button prompts they give you on screen are wrong. If you look at a tip before starting, it mentions how one attack actually combos into another, so I realised I needed to skip one input. But why on earth would you put button prompts on screen that are incorrect? Players are obviously going to follow the instructions on screen and not realise why they keep failing the combo. Your reward for doing all this is extra spear damage. The machine fight arena at least gives you actual weapon rewards. There's not much to say about this one though. It's just a place to fight machines if by some chance you haven't had enough of that from the main game. And then there are the races, which might be some of the worst content I've experienced in an otherwise good game for a very long time. They are horrible. I've no idea what the devs were thinking. The races are long with lots of luck and rubber banding, so you can easily lose at the end and have to redo the entire thing. There's combat during races, but it's an absolute shit show trying to attack enemies. Aloy constantly swings at the wrong side, like Road Rash did it better 30 years ago. The controls are awkward, like cross and circle for speeding up and slowing down. Square braces against attacks, which come in constantly. If you do get hit, R2 gets you back in the action, but it's also the ability button if you have one equipped. You're also supposed to grab items and abilities as they zoom past and use them to attack enemies, but firing arrows while racing isn't exactly comfortable if you're trying to hold down face buttons at the same time. I know bad content can just be ignored, and if you don't like it, just don't do it, but there is a point when it drags down the experience and leaves a bad taste in the mouth. It's okay to cut content, people. Not every idea has to end up in the game. As with Zero Dawn, Forbidden West classifies its smaller, less interesting quests as errands. These quests are quicker and generally don't have as much voice acting. However, it doesn't necessarily mean the mission itself isn't important. I found it quite amusing that in one instance, an NPC asked Aloy to help save a child's life from imminent danger, only to see it classified as an errand because I guess the quest itself wasn't that involved. Next, we need to look at crafting, because what is an open world game without crafting these days? Continuing the trend of simply adding more of everything that was in Horizon Zero Dawn, Forbidden West goes hard on the crafting, like all in on crafting. It's a crafting game now. Aloy's only in the Forbidden West to upgrade gear, she's killing the big machines for parts. Once again, Guerrilla Games is chasing a trend that I think most gamers are sick of at this point. There's nothing inherently wrong with crafting in games, like inventory limitations. It works well in a survival setting to replicate the feeling of being weak and battling against the odds. However, as with inventory limits, crafting got added to every game regardless of whether it improved the experience. Forbidden West places a huge emphasis on crafting. It's not quite essential, especially on lower difficulties, but it's highly encouraged. Pretty much everything is upgradable now. Each weapon and armour set can be upgraded 3, 4 or 5 times depending on the gear level, and bear in mind you will likely have at least 6 weapons that you keep handy and therefore want to upgrade, plus a couple of outfits. I made a genuine effort to engage with these systems, but I found them absolutely exhausting. The crafting system might have worked if it was used instead of new loot, if the only way to improve your weapon was to craft it to a higher level. Instead, you might spend a bunch of time upgrading a weapon to just get a better one shortly after, which disincentivises future crafting. Actually, having fixed weapons might have been much better. Imagine being given one weapon of each type and upgrading them how you choose, with an eye on different types of damage. So you could have fire arrows as an option on your hunter bow, frost on the blast sling, electricity on the bolt caster, etc. This way you would have to change weapons for different enemy types instead of relying on bows all the time. Alternatively, get rid of crafting and weapon upgrades entirely. This would make new loot feel meaningful. I rarely got excited about a new weapon because even if it had better base stats, it might not be an improvement over a leveled up version of a lower weapon. Nothing kills the joy of getting a new piece of loot than having to upgrade it first before it's an improvement on existing gear. There are way too many outfits as well. Like, do we really need 40 of them? Why not have one for stealth, one for melee and one for ranged combat? Then you could use the weaves to provide buffs to certain attributes, e.g. fire protection, and just change that on a fight by fight basis if you want. Appearance should be something players can change separately from the stats. Where the crafting becomes a joke is with the pouches. Each pouch can be upgraded at least 3 times. There are pouches for resources, potions, hunter arrows, precision arrows, traps, shredders, spikes, bolts, bombs and food. And if you use a variety of weapons, you'll need to upgrade all of these at least twice. What's far more likely to happen is that you won't bother using, say, the spikes and bombs because the ammo capacity is so low at the start it's prohibitive. And then because you're not using them, you won't go to the effort of getting the upgrades. Potions and food have the same problem. You can get some good buffs from these, but the carry limit is so low initially that I expect most people will ignore potions as a significant gameplay option. You can only carry 3, which you'll almost certainly devote to health, and then just forget there are endurance and overdraw potions available too. Pouch upgrades are at least easy because you just have to kill animals, but that also makes the process quite boring. There's a lot of animals to kill too. You often need to hunt at least 2 different animals in 2 different locations for each upgrade on each pouch. Keeping track of all this is a nightmare. You can create a job for materials you need, so it's not like you have to remember them all, but if you make a job for every upgrade you want, which could easily be 10 or more things, your map becomes a complete mess. And inventory management for the likes of potions, food and traps is crap as well. You use the D-pad to scroll between all your options, but there are a lot. In addition to all the variants of potions, traps and food, you might also have 2 mounts, a fast travel pack and rocks. You can deselect items, but if you pick up new stuff while looting, which you almost certainly will, they are added to the list. You never really know how many times you have to press the D-pad to reach the item you're after. The item cap is annoying here. Say you want all your potions to be large health potions, and then you use 2 in a fight. After the fight you loot everything and go to craft more large potions. But if you've picked up any other potions, e.g. small health or endurance potions, they count against your limit and means you can't craft another large one. Crafting as an experience is tedious, but that probably goes without saying at this point. You have to hold down a button for a second to pick up most loot, and there's a lot of loot to pick up. There's a band-aid for this in the options menu that supposedly keeps more of the loot on the machine after it's been destroyed, so it's not so spread out, but I didn't notice the difference. Much to my annoyance, after completely beating the game and even putting in another 10 hours to capture more footage, Guerrilla Games added an option to remove pickup animations on stuff like plants and trees, which you can now grab with just a button press. Another band-aid. Why this wasn't in the game from the start is baffling to me. Ghost of Tsushima had it, so again it's not new. I'm noticing a trend with major releases, including Sony's games, where features that should be in the game from the start are withheld from launch and then drip-fed out later. Almost as if Sony wants to stretch out the time the game is in the spotlight. As of the time of writing, there's no ultra hard mode or new game plus, but I bet those things are coming and I'm sure they could have been ready for launch. This stuff is deliberately withheld for more news cycles and it's annoying. Even with the latest patch, you still have to hold down the button to craft more ammo while at the workbench. This is really tedious when you want to just go through and fill up all your ammo pouches. So much of the collect and craft loot feels unnecessary. Fast travel packs are a consumable resource, presumably because that's the way it was in the last game, but why? They are so cheap to make that I can't imagine ever not having the necessary supplies. And there are campfires everywhere, so you don't really need to use them anyway. It's crafting for the sake of crafting. The funniest resource is undoubtedly the rocks. Aloy can throw rocks to distract enemies, but you have to have some on hand, which means it's another thing to pick up. Now, you might look at the environment here and think, rocks are everywhere, but no. You have to pick up special throwing rocks because apparently the rocky surface that you spend 99% of your time on doesn't have the right type. You'll occasionally be walking along and see a little icon for rocks and then look around and see rocks as far as the eye can see. It's an absurd and unnecessary situation. Is there any good reason why Aloy can't just have an unlimited supply of rocks on her at all times? Don't embarrass yourself in the comments by talking about realism. Aloy can carry an insane amount of stuff at any one time. Can't we just assume she's always got a rock lying around in amongst the 100 valuables, 20 outfits, 23 weapons, thousands of materials, etc.? Hell, that stuff is so disposable, why not let me throw watches, jewellery and even bows if I run out of rocks? That's all most of it is good for. Actually, I do wish more thought had been put into the valuables Aloy collects. There's thousands of them, but they're just random bits of tat. There's a quest where some characters are confused by a hard drive because they obviously don't recognise it. The valuables could be similar. Perhaps Aloy finds things but doesn't understand what they are or how they were used and makes silly little notes about them. I suppose her focus would just tell her, but that could be excused by saying the items are too rusted or damaged for the focus to recognise. I will give credit where it's due and say that inventory management has been improved. There are still limits on what you can carry, which is nearly always pointless except perhaps for health items, but if you hit the limit the items automatically get sent to your stash. It's annoying to move things from stash to your inventory, but there's a quick refill button and it's light years better than how Zero Dawn handled it. Forbidden West's combat continues the trend of more not necessarily being better. The additions remind me of what you get in good expansions like Blood and Wine for The Witcher 3 or even Frozen Wilds, the expansion to Horizon Zero Dawn. There are new weapons, damage types, enemies and special attacks layered on top of what was already there. In expansions this is usually fine. No one expects an expansion to completely reinvent the combat. Players are already comfortable with the system and just want new toys to play with. For a sequel to a game that didn't exactly have a perfect combat system, I expected and hoped for more fundamental changes. Forbidden West has the following weapon types: a hunter bow, warrior bow, sharpshot bow, rope caster, blast sling, bolt blaster, shredder gauntlet, spike thrower and a trip caster, plus traps and of course a basic spear. That's way more than fits on the weapon wheel. It desperately needs a second wheel like Ratchet and Clank games have. The lack of space is compounded when you consider the damage types. When thinking about your weapon loadout, you also need to consider fire, frost, acid, plasma, purge water and shock, plus adhesive and berserk. Even the most basic ass arrows come in light, normal, advanced, precision, targeting, strike through and tear varieties. It's a crazy amount of choice offering a lot of potential combat variety, and yet I nearly always use my standard hunter bow for damage and other hunter bows for elemental damage. I know I'm not the only one doing this. Everyone I've heard talk about the game nearly exclusively use bows because Forbidden West doesn't do enough to make using the other weapons worthwhile. The path of least resistance is nearly always a basic hunter arrow. Other weapons are too specific or cumbersome. The rope caster is definitely useful to pin down flying machines, but I didn't use it on other enemy types and I rarely had it equipped, which in turn meant I then didn't actually use it for flying machines because I couldn't be bothered to switch around my gear. The bolt blaster is powerful but slow as hell, especially when reloading, which you have to do when changing ammo types. The blast sling is great for elemental damage, but if I have arrows that do the same elemental damage, it's often easier to use them instead. Perhaps if I'd gotten a better blast sling earlier I would have used this more, but I was stuck with a low level one for a long time. The trip caster and traps are good for when you haven't been spotted, but stealth isn't a fun way to play because there's so much waiting around. You lay a trap, wait for a machine to walk into it and hopefully die, then nearby machines are alerted and you wait an eternity for them to stop searching before you sneak over and lay another trap and repeat. The shredder gauntlet is good for ripping off armour and gets more powerful each time you throw one if you keep catching them. The spike thrower just felt bad and not worth the effort to use. Even the other bow types aren't that useful. The sharpshot bow is good for tear damage, which rips armour from machines. However, it's also incredibly slow and it's very easy to miss shots or not hit exactly the piece of armour you're targeting. In my case I was better off using my regular arrows, which did almost as much tear damage as the tear arrows but could be fired much faster. Perhaps I just got unlucky in not finding a better sharpshot bow. The warrior bow is supposedly for up close situations, but I was able to use my hunter bow easily enough. I tried using adhesive arrows with the warrior bow but barely noticed it slow down the enemy at all. I found a good hunter bow with berserk arrows, but the regular arrows on it were bad and I didn't want a third hunter bow on the weapon wheel just for berserk. The only time I really mixed up weapons was when I got a big upgrade, e.g. a shredder gauntlet that was way better at ripping off armour than my tear arrows. Forbidden West really needs a big rethink on how it deals with elemental damage types. Maybe berserk and adhesive arrows shouldn't be restricted to specific bows, like after all they are arrows, let me use them with any bow. You could say the same for all elemental arrows. Or conversely, maybe bows shouldn't do elemental damage at all. If you want to do fire or acid damage, you have to use a special weapon, like the blast sling. The slight issue here is that you wouldn't be able to use arrows to target the canisters with the matching element to create a big explosion, which is fun. Regular arrows probably shouldn't do tear damage because that removes the incentive to use tear arrows. It should be harder to tear those important pieces off machines. As it stands, I tore loads of armour off without even trying, probably because the game desperately wants you to engage with the crafting system. Actually, you could probably get rid of the 3 bow types altogether. Have one bow with regular arrows and tear arrows, maybe elemental ones too if you want. Do we really need a special bow just to use tear arrows and shoot slightly further? It just takes up space on the wheel. And there's no need for a warrior bow, which takes away a much needed incentive to engage with the melee system. There are some completely new features too. During combat you can activate Valor mode, which provides a series of buffs depending on which one you have active, and each weapon has a special attack, so you're never short of options during combat. On the surface then, Forbidden West's combat is deep and should reward skillful play. Every machine has pages of info that you can use to work out which pieces of armour to strip to access weak spots and how to disable weapons. And yet most of the time you just aim at the obvious canisters that do big damage and then pepper the machines with arrows. Aiming for particular weak spots is surprisingly hard because the damage system is insanely precise. There's full-on hitbox porn for how arrows will skim past machines. If you miss by as little as the width of one of Aloy's facial hairs that a bunch of idiots who've never met a woman before got angry about, you won't deal damage. This is not a complaint, by the way. It's pretty cool to watch arrows slide through narrow gaps. It just means it's not worth your effort trying to target very small weak spots because you'll usually miss. Forbidden West's basic combat experience is alright. Not many other games let you go up against beasts like this and chip away at them by literally chipping away at them and removing parts. I still love watching machines fall apart piece by piece. Not enough games have enemies that get weaker as their health gets lower, but if you fight tactically you strip away their most powerful weapons and make them more vulnerable by removing armour. They get easier to fight the more damage they become, and that's how it should be. Some enemies seem a bit nerfed compared to the previous game. Snapmaws put up a hell of a fight in Zero Dawn, but here they don't know how to attack you if you have any kind of high ground, and they conveniently swim around with weak spots poking out above the water when they could just go under to avoid all damage. Aiming is aided by gyro controls, which helps when you just need a small adjustment to your aim. Moving a DualSense controller isn't as easy as moving one Joy-Con when playing on the Switch, but it's still a welcome addition. Unfortunately, the gyro controls are also active while scanning machines, so unless you keep the controller 100% still, the scan may struggle to properly register or flick between parts. While I enjoyed most combat encounters, there were too many fights that felt bad due to excessive tracking and terrible hitboxes. Now, before getting into this, I want to acknowledge that these issues are not as simple as they sound. I'm not against all enemy tracking. There's always going to be a bit of this because otherwise it'd be too easy to avoid damage by dodging early or just casually circle strafing. I think it's fine to test players' reactions a bit, and at full speed it's not always noticeable. And hitboxes are hard to get right and rarely match the model exactly. For context, I'm currently playing through Dark Souls 2, which has some of the worst tracking and hitboxes I've ever seen, so I have some tolerance for this stuff. For pretty much any game, a video editor can slow footage down and show tracking and hitbox problems to make it look worse than it really is. I make a rule never to go searching for these problems because I know I'll nearly always find them. However, if something feels wrong in the heat of the moment, I'll make a note and go back to look at the footage. I made a lot of those notes while playing Forbidden West. Let's look at tracking. It's one thing for an enemy to turn a lot while attacking to stop you jumping to the side or circle strafing. It's quite another for an enemy to slide across the ground towards you so that an attack which you would otherwise have missed hits. Here are some examples. This machine is standing on its right foot and turning. You can imagine where the left foot is going to land and where the tail swipe will reach. However, the tracking here is so egregious that the tail never becomes a problem. It's actually the foot that hits me and deals damage because somehow that left leg lands on me. Look how far away I am when he begins the move. I then roll away, which I think is what triggers the machine to reach even further as it moves. It's like the game decided in advance the foot was going to land on me and had to account for my movement accordingly. This example isn't as clear, but you can see the hind legs slide towards me a lot in order to bring the tail into range as once again I dodge away. Now a big tail swipe would probably drag the feet along the floor with it, but only after the tail, not before. This is an example that is just about okay. It felt bad in the moment, but with hindsight I think that's because the hitbox was off. Even with tracking, the hit can't reach me, but it still does damage. This one is bad because not only do both feet slide forward a lot, the head which hits me barely moves. It's not a case of the attack causing the feet to slide. The attack is the machine sliding towards you. There's no attempt to match it with an animation. Likewise, there's no jump animation here with this machine. It just reaches out its arm and somehow that sends it sliding in towards me. It's insane how much ground it stretches across it. I had no reason to expect the raised arm would get anywhere near me given the distance. In the same fight, the machine's head lands the other side of that patch of grass, and yet within one frame goes from being behind the grass to hitting Aloy on the other side. Like, its neck isn't that long. Here, if you look at how the snake's head lands, you can imagine where it's going, but then it slides over to Aloy to deal damage. Shortly after this though, there's an attack where I almost can't believe it doesn't deal damage. This stuff is really common with the bigger machines. Less so the smaller ones because they are legitimately nimble and can make up ground without cheating quite so much. Mind you, humans do it too. Look at where this guy's feet are planted when he starts his swing and where they end up when he hits me. Again, it's probably because I've tried to dodge away. There's clearly some input reading going on and the game has decided I'm going to get hit regardless. Shortly after, the same guy did it again with his feet sliding across the ground, and it shouldn't have been given as a hit anyway. Credit where it's due though, some animations are cool. I thought something dodgy happened here, but looking again, the machine flicks a rock up out of the ground and then heads it towards Aloy like the machine equivalent of Benzema. Tracking verges on cheap at times, but the hitboxes are borderline cheating. This is doubly annoying because they can be great. I did a lot of last minute dodges where frankly I wouldn't have complained if a hit was registered. I found myself making notes about good hitboxes while playing, not just bad ones, which is unusual because usually I'm looking for excuses. But still, the bad outweighs the good. The cause in most cases is the hitbox extending too far in front of the machine. Aloy is hit way too early by attacks that haven't reached. Many times she may have ended up getting hit anyway, but it feels wrong when there's a visible gap when damage is dealt. This hit absolutely misses. Like, I'm not even sure what's doing the damage. The machine's head turns a lot as it jumps, so it could be an early hit from that. The damage frame on this attack is so early it's laughable, and it wasn't going to hit me anyway. Just to compound the issue, I'm then hit a couple more times because the first attack stun locks me. Against the same machine, there's a mixture of bad tracking and a bad hitbox. Either way, this should absolutely not hit me. This one was extra frustrating because I had full health and it was a tough fight relatively early in the game. The laser here goes well over Aloy's head, and this time the hit is registered late. This is the damage frame. This machine leaps at me and is embarrassingly far away when it supposedly hits me, either with its head or foot, I'm not sure. Now I'm probably getting hit here anyway, but the hit is early. I have no idea how I took damage here. I dive away from the machine and I'm well in the clear when I suddenly take damage. Now is this a really bad hitbox or is there some kind of AoE damage here? This is the damage frame. That's a common issue actually. Invisible AoE blast or bad hitbox. Like the snake here misses by a long way and the head ends up nowhere near me, but I guess I'm hit by the blast or a bad hitbox on the body. This happens a lot when fighting these things. The AoE attacks are a bit too much anyway. Again, I don't want to be a complete dick about these, I try to cut a bit of slack. So for example, these rocks have a pretty egregious blast zone, but well, I guess that's okay. However, the fire comes out of this gizmo at the back here and it's facing well away from Aloy. But then the fire just weirdly spreads out to the side and kills me. Or is it the tail swipe that kills me and the hit is just being registered early? Now, like, what is going on here? I'm hit by an AoE from a tail slam, but the AoE effect appears way before the tail hits the ground. I don't take issue with being hit here because it's fair, but the visual information is off. Again, the important thing isn't whether it counts as fair, it's how it feels in the moment, and this feels awful. I'm fighting the final boss here, and the missiles have sailed a mile over my head and yet somehow still do blast damage. This snake machine has an incredibly annoying lightning attack that sometimes I swear is impossible to avoid. I dodged the initial attack, but the blast zone is huge and hits me anyway. These snakes are quite impressive, which is perhaps why you fight them a lot. I love the way they wrap around objects in the environment. It can glitch a bit and get caught up in itself, but given how difficult this must be to pull off, I won't complain. I think this machine magically makes fire appear from the ground, which is cool, but it doesn't make a ton of sense. This tail slam does damage, but it's way too far away for that to be reasonable. A minor gripe is that Aloy often goes flying in the wrong direction when hit. It doesn't really matter, I guess, it just adds to the sense of not trusting the information given on screen. A little different, but this enemy is clearly aiming away from Aloy and the lasers are nowhere near her. In the next frame, he turns to face her and she takes damage in the same frame. So clearly the lasers change direction before his aim. And the shell snappers have a rocket attack that is incredibly hard to avoid. You have about a third of a second to dodge as long as you see the flash, but it's relatively small and hard to make out in the heat of battle. I had to go back over the footage to even see what was hitting me here. In real time you just seemingly get blasted out of nowhere. Combat can also feel frustrating due to the excessive amount of stagger Aloy suffers. She takes just ever so slightly too long to get up from falls, and if hit with electricity she goes down in this weird slapstick manner where she locks up and falls flat. In some cases you get stun locked to death, but most machines don't take advantage of it. They seem as surprised as you are. The stagger is most annoying when Aloy remains on her feet because she's just randomly taken out of your control for a few seconds and it's not clear when you'll get it back. You end up hammering buttons while you wait. This is most egregious when fighting the Rockbreaker who stuns Aloy by shaking the ground, and it can be hard to avoid. I haven't spoken about combat against human enemies much. Fighting humans and clearing out camps were clear weak points in the first game, and as you've probably guessed at this point, the sequel keeps this basically the same but with more options layered on top. Enemies are nearly always heavily armoured now, including headpieces to prevent easy headshots, which makes sense, although once those headpieces have been removed, the enemies can still take multiple arrows to the head, which looks especially stupid in the case of boss enemies on higher difficulties, where a perfect headshot does barely any damage. They should have just made the headpieces much harder to break off, because this is silly. Speaking of silly, Aloy's dodge roll can be heavily directed mid-roll, kind of like Geralt's in The Witcher 2, so you can dodge to the side and then roll around to get behind enemies. As for the camps, you can still sneak up on enemies fairly easily, and they are still stupid enough to walk up to the same patch of grass one after the other, practically forming a queue for you to take them out. I do like that you only need to kill the camp leader. You can leave after that and the enemies disappear later. It's quite satisfying to sneak in and kill the leader but no one else and then leave. Camps have lots of grapple points, so I would fling Aloy up into the air for aerial takedowns. When it works, it does look quite cool. I genuinely tried to make these sections fun, but ultimately they are still camps of enemies that are far less interesting to fight than the machines, and Aloy is way too powerful for them to pose a threat. The only times I really struggled in these sections were when the humans had machines under their control, and then the difficulty was in dealing with the machine. Speaking of difficulty, most of Forbidden West is fairly easy, and the difficulty balancing is a complete mess, especially for the main campaign. In my Horizon Zero Dawn video, I committed the cardinal sin of criticising the combat while not playing on the hardest available difficulty. After doing YouTube for 5 years, I now know that if you're going to criticise something popular, you have to play on the hardest difficulty. Because if you don't, fanboys who can't handle their favourite toy being critiqued will insist that the highest difficulty completely changes the experience for the better. I remember one guy, it's always a guy, in the Zero Dawn comments, or maybe an email actually, I can't remember, saying how playing on the hardest setting is the only way to play because it makes you change weapons and outfits, and even the mods on those weapons and outfits for every fight. He would even change gear mid-fight as he switched between machines. This supposedly adds to the immersion because there's nothing more immersive than pausing the game just as a machine is about to slam into you to change outfits. It sounds like a miserable way to play to me. I've already seen people saying the same about Forbidden West. You know the sort of thing. If you play on very hard, it's more immersive because you have to scrounge for resources and play cautiously, and it really makes you feel like a red-haired clone of a 21st century scientist living 1,000 years in the future fighting robot animals and dinosaurs. There is sometimes an element of truth to this nonsense. An obvious example is The Witcher 3, where playing on harder difficulties encourages you to engage with more of the systems. However, 99% of the time it's bullshit from gamers trying to do some weird flex. You should absolutely not have to play on the hardest difficulty to critique a game's combat. However, just to avoid another round of those comments, I played Forbidden West on the hardest difficulty for my main playthrough, and I can confirm that you don't need to. On very hard you take more damage and deal less. It's the same game. Sure, you need to target enemy weaknesses or you'll be there forever, but you're probably doing that regardless of difficulty. Unlike, say, The Witcher 3, I didn't have to engage with different upgrade paths or do a lot of fight prep. Resources are still plentiful, so very hard difficulty doesn't transform Forbidden West into a survival sim. In my 80 hours with the game, the only time I didn't have enough resources to craft what I wanted was a shortage of echo shells for tear arrows soon after I got my first sharpshot bow. It's the same game still. Fights last longer, you die quicker, that's it. I will say the first boss, this massive snake thing, was incredibly tough because you basically have no upgrades. And for up to maybe the 10-hour point, I played very cautiously and avoided fights. After that though, I could take on whatever I wanted. The final boss on very hard took about 12 minutes to completely chip away the health bar, but I still wouldn't call it difficult, and I was wearing gear that was specifically weak to the damage type being dealt because I forgot to change it. Forbidden West's lack of difficulty is partly because you're always vastly over-leveled. You'd have to actively ignore everything except the main quest line not to be over-leveled, and even then you might be. I realised early on that I was getting way above the recommended level, We're talking 10 levels above a level 24 quest, for example. I started ignoring nearly all the optional content. I didn't do any errands and only did one each of the hunting grounds, melee pits and races. Even so, I hit the level cap of 50 during the final mission, which had a recommended level of 35. It's no wonder the final boss was easy. I added a little artificial difficulty by not using skill points, although truth be told this probably didn't make much difference, which says something about the skill points. About halfway through the game I realised I'd forgotten to spend a bunch of them. I had 40 odd available. This game throws a lot of skill points at you. I went to use them and realised I didn't really care about any of the options. I'd already bought the obviously useful stuff like extra concentration and improved health potions, but I didn't care about being able to do extra damage from mounts or putting traps down quicker. I probably sound a little hypocritical right now because I criticised Zero Dawn for making you unlock things that should have been unlocked from the start. Forbidden West gives you most options out of the gate. I mean, I expected to have to unlock aerial attacks, but no, it's a default option. Unfortunately, Forbidden West maybe went too far the other way because the skill tree is largely pointless now. I know, they really can't win sometimes, can they? After spending 40 plus skill points in one go, I decided to ignore them right up until the final mission. By that point I had 116 skill points. 116. That was enough to unlock nearly everything, and remember, I'd been avoiding a lot of the content to try and not over level. I got a bunch more points later when going back to do the optional content. Most skill points are spent on Valor abilities and special weapon attacks. The problem here is that you'll likely get your preferred Valor ability early on and then use it all the time. They're not really useful enough to justify constantly switching them out. They're just another buff on top of all the other buffs available like food and potions. And I rarely bothered with the special weapon abilities. They continue the trend of adding options to the combat and assuming that somehow makes it better. I loved Zero Dawn's story. There were pacing issues in the middle, where Aloy worked with clans to resolve their drama, but everything about the historical events that led up to the state of the world was fascinating, and unfortunately unrepeatable. The main story in Forbidden West is good, but by main story I absolutely do not mean everything in the main questline. There's a lot of absolute nonsense in there, which is incredibly difficult to care about. This is perhaps best illustrated by an early storyline where Aloy can't so much as head into the Forbidden West until she gets a bunch of rival clans together to ask them nicely. This in turn requires her to blow a horn, which she can't do till she's helped someone else, and oh god, why should we care about any of this? I'm not entirely convinced Aloy cares either. Half the time she sounds bored and the other half frustrated that she's having to deal with this bullshit. Why would Aloy ask permission to travel west anyway? Like, the West feels a lot less forbidden when you've been given express permission to be there. Aloy also really hates it when other people praise her and give her glorious titles for what she did in Zero Dawn, and insists people call her just Aloy. This specific wording pops up at least 6 times, and I should put together a full highlight reel, but I don't take as much pride in my work as certain other YouTubers, so here's the few examples I did find.
She's Meridian's savior, not yours.
It's just Aloy.
I'd say luck just brought us the savior of Meridian.
Just Aloy.
May we be led to truth?
Just Aloy.
My humblest thanks to you, great champion, for delivering my mother and me from Sunfall, and for defending our holy city against the forces of Shadow. Did I say right?
I'm a witcher.
Part of the problem is simply mislabeling quests. There were storylines I would have enjoyed a lot more if they were labelled as side quests. Instead, they're shoehorned into the main storyline where they clearly don't fit and feel worse for it. I'm all for more streamlined mandatory quests, but I guess developers are terrified of headlines or just random tweets saying that you can complete the game in 15 hours or whatever. There are some silly parts in the story as well, like one mission tasks you with blowing up the big wall that protects the village, but it's also an integral part of the structure. Like, Aloy could have easily wiped out this entire village. The meat of the main story comes after reactivating Gaia when Aloy is tasked with finding 3 of Gaia's subsystems, which should be enough to capture another subsystem, Hephaestus. This takes the form of 3 major quests, which you can do in any order, but they also have recommended levels, so nearly everyone will do them in the same order. The story gets good when this lot rock up. Not that it was a complete surprise. I suppose I should give a spoiler warning here, but actually it might be too late, because if you watched my video on Zero Dawn, then I basically spoiled the plot 5 years ago. Okay, bit of an exaggeration, but I had the gist of it down. I won't subject you to that video's terrible audio, so here's a trimmed down and slightly tidier version of what I said back then. Try to imagine I sound 33 again and a little less world weary. The most obvious unanswered question is who sent the message that made the subordinate functions go rogue in the first place. I think it was the Odyssey crew or the new humans grown on that ship. Sobek mentions in a journal that the mission failed, but I don't think it did. From a storytelling perspective, it seems odd to even introduce the concept if you're going to kill it off just as quickly. Perhaps the crew survived and flourished in space. Why would they risk destroying the Earth? Well, maybe they want to reclaim Earth for themselves. Now, this is absolutely me bragging like an arrogant arsehole for getting something right, but I hope you'll forgive me because A, I don't get to celebrate being right too often, and B, I got a lot of shit for this. People were weirdly angry with me for having the nerve to guess where the sequel might be going, even emailing me to tell me I was talking crap with comments like, "The journal says the ship was destroyed and therefore it must have been. The game said so, it has to be true." Media literacy has truly never been lower. The thing with making predictions like this is that it's often a lose-lose game. The ones who criticise don't come back to the channel 5 years later to admit you were right, and others just say, well, it was obvious that's where the story was going. It's amazing how many things are obvious with hindsight. Weirdly, I also speculated that Ted Farrow experimented on himself to preserve his life and that he might still be alive in the present day. That's technically true. He did experiment on himself and is still alive, but ended up becoming a literal monster and is kept off camera. I found this bit a little odd actually. It didn't add much to the story, but I guess it's good to know what happened to him. Although clone technology exists, so who knows. The Odyssey/Far Zenith crew did survive and built a society on another planet. They're also almost immortal. The ones who show up here are the same ones who left Earth 1,000 years ago. That's an important distinction because the people on the ship were a bunch of rich arseholes who bought the failing Odyssey project to save themselves. However, it wasn't them who sent the extinction signal to Earth. Not directly, at least. It was an entity called Nemesis that they created to be a sort of mine storage facility, but it went rogue. I mean, what do you expect if you call it Nemesis? Far Zenith escaped their planet and headed back to Earth with the goal of stealing Gaia and starting again elsewhere. After defeating Far Zenith, the game ends with the cliffhanger that Nemesis is coming to destroy life on Earth once and for all. The Far Zenith crew have their own clone of Elizabeth Sobek called Beta. Despite also being a clone, Beta is completely different to Aloy. Good with technology, but very anxious. It's pretty obvious why this is the case. I mean, instead of training with Rost and growing up on a dangerous planet, Beta was brought up as a prisoner, a tool to be used in specific circumstances. In other words, nature versus nurture. Two identical people, brought up in different ways, grow up to be different people. If this sounds obvious to you, then, well, yeah, me too. The game seems to think it's a big deal though, and comes across kind of patronising as it explains it. I'm glad Guerrilla Games went the Far Zenith route instead of making an entire game out of the story with Sylens and the Hades subroutine, and not just because it meant I got to spend a few minutes saying I told you so. The Sylens and Hades bromance never felt worthy of a full sequel story, and it would have left questions from the first game unanswered, such as the sender of the extinction signal. That said, I wasn't expecting them to dismiss the Hades story so quickly. At the start of the game, Aloy is searching for a Gaia backup to help restore the planet. Aloy then finds Hades and just deletes it. Boom, problem solved. It's a cool way to completely subvert expectations. Whether it was planned this way though, I'm not convinced. Sylens is hardly in the game, which is a great shame considering how incredible Lance Reddick is. I've seen people suggest he was too busy to do a bigger role, but I doubt it's that. Looking at his projects, he seems just as busy now as he was for Zero Dawn, and he is in the game, just not as much as I'd like. If the plan was to have him be a major part of the sequel, you'd expect Guerrilla Games to lock him down early on, and I'm sure they'd rather wait for a gap in his availability than rewrite the entire story. Right before the credits, the writers try to make Sylens important again, as if he wasn't relegated to a minor character for most of the game. He claims he knew about Nemesis the entire time and didn't tell Aloy because then she would have acted differently and it wouldn't have gone according to plan. I hate it when writers do the thing where one character knows everything but doesn't tell the main character because it would supposedly change how they act. It always feels cheap and ignores the many ways that could have gone very wrong. I suppose if it means Reddit gets a better role in the third game, I'll accept it. Sylens' unusual role leaves me to believe that Guerrilla Games didn't quite know where it was going when it created that endgame teaser in Zero Dawn, which to be fair is true of most teasers of that ilk. Maybe it wanted Hades to be the main story here with the Far Zenith reveal popping up at the end as a teaser for the third game, but realised there wasn't enough there to make an entire game around. My suspicion is that the Hades story was going to play a bigger role and that the main tribal conflict with Regala would have been linked to that. She could have been working with Sylens to further Hades' goals. As it stands, Regala doesn't fit into the main story in an interesting way at all. It's side quest level content in all but name. Instead of combining Hades, Regala and Far Zenith into one story, the three are kept distinct, with the first two clearly inferior to the main event. While I enjoyed the Far Zenith part of the story, the storytelling is clumsy in places and Forbidden West is way overwritten. The opening of the game hits you over the head with the main story beats. Within an hour I knew the Far Zenith crew had definitely survived and would be a major part of the story, because the Odyssey mission is recapped at the start even though it wasn't a huge part of the Zero Dawn story. Like, hey, you may have missed this thing from the first game or forgotten about it, so here's a little reminder that may come in useful later. Hint hint. Another thing foreshadowed to a painful degree was that Aloy would work with her friends to take down the big bad together instead of going it alone. Early on, Aloy keeps saying stuff like, I have to do this myself, and her friends insist she rely on them. So of course she does, and they all go into battle together at the end. Well, not all of them. Val dies in combat, which is unfortunate because he was probably my favourite of the crew. I'm certainly not against major character deaths, but this one didn't serve much purpose, and I get the impression Guerrilla just wanted to include a major death for the sake of it. I don't think his death changed Aloy or motivated any part of the story. If anything, it would have made Aloy less likely to work with her friends because it proves that when she brings them along, they die. Aloy can communicate with her team easily because they all have focus devices. Remember how big a deal the focus was in the first game? Well, Aloy found a whole stash of them and gives them out to everyone she meets, like Oprah Winfrey giving out cars to people who successfully endure an entire episode of her show. There's also too much exposition, like way too much. Conversations with the likes of Gaia and Tilda are so long with so many options that some of those options open up secondary dialogue wheels with even more options. The result is you end up sitting there for sometimes over half an hour having information dumped on you. 30 minutes is an insane amount of time for an info dump, and should have been a red flag that there were major structural problems with the writing and story in this game. Some of this information would have been better delivered through journals and the like, which you can then read at your leisure instead of listening to people speaking very slowly. Or the conversations could have played out more naturally through cutscenes. I get why Guerrilla wanted to do the dialogue wheel thing, because in theory players can choose what they want to hear, but in practice it means it takes way longer than it should to get the information across, because the writers have to assume each answer is the first or only answer the player listens to. Structured cutscenes might make it less boring to look at. Take this big conversation with Tilda, one of the Far Zenith crew. Tilda often gets up and walks around a bit while answering Aloy's question to add a bit of movement, but she always has to sit back down at the end to get back into that neutral pose for the next question. The same conversation could have been quicker and more interesting if the conversation had been fixed with Aloy and Tilda exploring the base as they spoke instead of sitting at this table. It's a shame because Tilda is voiced by the excellent Carrie-Anne Moss, but these tedious bouts of exposition don't exactly give her much to work with. Oh, Elrond returns, although I don't think anyone quite knew what to do with him. The whole game suffers from overwriting and a general quantity over quality approach, which fits with the theme of more but not necessarily better. There are some cool characters. I really liked Alva, and there are smaller side characters like these engineers and the guy with the hot air balloon. I liked how the head of Alba's tribe, who worshipped Ted Farrow, was called CEO, as in CEO. There are nice touches like that throughout the game, I just found them too few and far between. Horizon Forbidden West can be stunning to look at. A lot of work, perhaps too much, went into making this a showpiece game for the PS5. And yeah, at 4K it does look ridiculous. There's a big caveat though, it's at 30 FPS. The 60 FPS mode is at a reduced resolution of 1800p-ish. I'm not a huge frame rate snob. I played Zero Dawn at 30 FPS and had no issues, and the team at Digital Foundry actually recommended the 4K 30 mode over the 60 FPS mode. So I decided to play Forbidden West at 4K. I even moved my PS5 to the main TV, which is why I later had to go back and re-record the footage. It was not worth it. The 30 FPS mode feels sluggish when moving the camera, and unsurprisingly the game is much smoother at 60 FPS. Now that sounds obvious, right? In fact, I think most people would take 1800p 60 over 4K 30 for a game like this. Unfortunately, it's a tougher decision than it sounds because Guerrilla made graphical cutbacks to hit 1800p. The draw distance and incredible level of detail are still there, but there's a slight blurriness and shimmer on a lot of the textures, so it doesn't feel like 1800p. Now, I still think it's worth the trade-off, but it's undeniably a noticeable trade-off, and bigger than you might expect from the numbers. What I would have personally preferred is a 1440p mode that maintained the graphical presets of the 4K mode just at a reduced resolution. 1440p is a sweet spot for me. I don't particularly need 4K. So why wasn't this an option? Well, I don't blame Gorilla for this. PS5s don't recognise most 1440p monitors. So if you hook a PS5 up to a 1440p monitor, like I do, the PS5 will only output at 1080p. This is really annoying. I know that consoles are usually hooked up to TVs, which are likely either 4K or 1080p, but I can't be the only person who uses a monitor. Forbidden West's world in general is amazingly detailed, maybe even too detailed. It's cluttered at times, which leads to those issues navigating the world that I discussed earlier. Facial animations are better across the board. In Zero Dawn, Aloy and the other major characters looked great, but less important ones were a bit rough. The quality is consistent now, although understandably Aloy is still a cut above the rest. Water areas are impressive and almost make up for the fact that swimming sections always suck and always will. Look, I'm sorry, but 30 years on I'm still tortured by the music that plays when Sonic is running out of water in Labyrinth Zone. And stealth and water just don't mix, even if you add something specifically called stealth kelp to hide in. There's a lot of environmental variety, although you often go from one climate to another a little abruptly for my taste. I apologise if I sound a bit underappreciative of the work put into making this game look so great. There are cool touches everywhere, like how one rock pile depletes and the other gets bigger as NPCs move them around. It must have cost a lot of money and man hours to make this much stuff look this good. I'm just getting to the point where I don't care that much about photorealistic visuals in games and would prefer resources be allocated elsewhere. Video games as a whole can do so much more than simply looking as real as possible, like leave that to movies. One thing that takes away from Forbidden West's visual splendour is the sheer quantity of bugs and niggles that suggest the game wasn't quite finished. It's far from the most broken game I've ever played, but it's more broken than I expected given the team, time and money involved. Here's a little selection of what I saw while playing. An NPC invisible during a conversation.
You kicked my ass in the pit, but I can still offer you training.
Falling out of the play space during a canned animation. The map displaying the location of gemstones that I'd already collected. This has since been patched out. The environmental destruction can be really good, but it does have a tendency to leave assets floating in the air. Aloy got confused about whether she was jumping into water or onto a ledge. NPCs get stuck, which stops you progressing quests. Flying enemies generally being a bit of a mess during combat and glitching around or getting stuck in the air. Being told to open a gate to let allies help me with a fight even though I'd already done that and they were helping. NPCs glitching through machines during cutscenes. Human enemies glitching out and just standing there. In this scene the bird is duplicated. Machines generally not reacting well with the environment, like glitching into the air or into the ground. Critical strikes don't always work. Aloy got into this small space, but I have no idea how she's supposed to get out. Aloy gets weirdly glitchy too at times. During one quest you have the optional goal of collecting flowers before killing the machines. I collected enough, but Aloy said I hadn't, but then I was able to turn them in. Aloy says I could really use that ballista right now while she's using a ballista. There are also signs of quests being changed or reordered. Aloy says I've not seen you since the Battle of the Grove, even though I'd just done another quest with that NPC. Or when Aloy insists we scan a slaughter spine in the main quest because it's new, except it's not new. There's one that is right next to the boat that you have to take to reach this part of the map. You can't miss it. I think someone must have gone back and added a slaughter spine to the beach at a later date because I'm sure the intent was for this to be a big fight against a new machine. So yeah, there are issues. I'm sure COVID impacted development, but that just means the devs should have been given more time. I'm going to conclude by repeating that I do quite like Forbidden West. It's not bad or even mediocre, it's decent, it's just incredibly disappointing bearing in mind the 5-year wait and the fact that even Ubisoft games have done some of this stuff better. More of the same is not enough and can even make the overall product worse. You can only add so many new things on top of the existing base before the whole thing starts to topple over. I assume the third game is at least 4 years away, which will put it 9 or 10 years out from the first game. I hope Guerrilla Games takes the time it needs to make major changes to the formula, because I don't want to play the same game with even more stuff layered on top in 2026. Okay, thank you for sticking with me during this long video. If you want to support this type of content, I do have a Patreon where you can sign up and get your name in the credits for $1 a month. And I only charge in months where I put out a major video. Alright, until next time, cheers.